First, we have a special category of halacha. Usually, when we talk about time-bound positive mitzvot aseh she'azman grama, women are exempt. Tefillin, Torah study, davening, different things like that. But there's a category where they are time-bound, they are positive, and women are not only obligated, but have an extra special obligation. And we call this afhen hayu be'oto hanes. This line appears 3 times in the Gemara. We're going to look at it in Masachet Shabbat. It also appears in Psachim and also Megillah. In Shabbat is when it discusses women and its relationship with Chanuka. So the line in Hebrew is Isha vadai madlicha. So a woman for sure lights. Da'amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Nashim chayavot b'ner Chanuka. Because Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, who's the speaker in all 3 of these sections, also in Pesach with the 4 cups of wine, and in Megillah with the listening and reading of Megillat Esther, says, Nashim chayavot b'ner Chanuka. Women are obligated to light the Chanuka candles. She'af hen hayu be'oto hanes. There's actually a disagreement as to what exactly that means. Here, the translation says, different ways of the Greek creed to be better first. Women were just as much obligation. And the second reason is a really different way of understanding this expression, not that we were part of the same danger, but that it was actually because of a woman that the miracle happened. Rashi doesn't say who that woman was. We're going to see how this develops. So the Shulchan Aruch says on Hilchot Chanuka that on the 25th of Kislev, we began the 8 days of Chanuka, where it's forbidden to eulogize and fast, but it is permitted to do work. The women, however, are accustomed not to do work while the candles are still lit. And there are those who say that there's no leniency for them. So just based on this halacha, it seems that the Shulchan Aruch, Rav Yosef Cairo, is taking the opinion that there was something special about women. Not that we were in the same danger as men, but something over, above, and beyond, to the extent that we actually have a special mitzvah not to do work during the time that the candles are lit. The Mishnah Berurah comments on that and says, specifically the women, because the miracle was done by way of them, as we learn below, and there are places where the men are stringent in this. So he does say there are some places where men also don't do work, so that perhaps could go with the idea that we were all in the same danger and we should refrain from work while the candles are lit. But the Mishnah Berurah really seems to be stressing that there's a specific women in mind, and that's what we're going to see here. I chose a picture of an ancient cheese-making woman. So the Shulchan Aruch says, there are those who say that one should eat cheese on Chanukah because the miracle was done with milk that Judith, so we're going to see how this name kind of changes and her identity and what she is. Judith fed the enemy, and he gets that from the Kolbo and the Ran. So these are both 13th, 14th century rabbis, a little later than we would expect to find the name of this woman. And the Mishnah Berurah adds a little bit more information, which we're going to see makes it even more confusing as opposed to more clear. So that Judith fed, she was the daughter of Yochanan the Kohen Gadol. So keep that in mind. Judith, the daughter of the Yochanan the Kohen Gadol. And there was a decree that all engaged girls would be taken first by the Greek governor, and she fed him from her bundles of cheese to get him drunk, and she cut off his head, and they all fled. This might be the story that a lot of you are familiar with, and we're going to see all the stories in a bit. The next source is the Ben Ish Chai, and he addresses the issue that a lot of people say about the story of Judith. So the story of Judith isn't really found in many Jewish sources. It's found in very late Midrashim. We know it from the Christian Bible. They preserved it in the Apocrypha. And there's a lot of debate as to when it actually took place and whether it was actually Chanuka. But the Ben Ish Chai dismisses those complaints, and he says that Yehudit, while it might not have been at the same time as the Chanuka story, it doesn't matter because it was also Greeks, and it was also when our lives were in danger, and she saved us. And he gives us another example, which is an interesting custom. It might be an Iraqi custom from Baghdad, where he came from, that they would eat seeds on Purim as a remembrance of the miracle of Daniel, who was able to stay a raw food vegetarian in the house of Nebuchadnezzar when he was brought there in the Babylonian exile. So even though Daniel and the Purim story didn't occur at the same time, it's a remembrance of those miracles that happened in the same era and in the same area. So that's why Judith is associated with Chanuka. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the women. So I'm going to tell you about 3 different women who all have a role to play in the Chanuka story, each one in their own unique way. Even if you're a man listening to this, I think there's still a lot to learn from these women, especially given the time we are in now, also in a time of war, just like Hanukkah was a time of war. And each woman has her own special lesson to teach us. So the one, besides Judith, that most of you were probably familiar with, is the one we usually call Chana and her 7 sons. So we don't actually see the name Chana associated with this woman until the Yalkut Shimoni, which is a very late collection of midrashim, perhaps from the 1300s. And this is a very interesting context where we see her. So it's commenting on the pasuk, Moshivi Akeret Habayit. He sets the barren woman of the house, Em Habanim Smecha, the happy mother of children. So who are women we know from Tanakh who were barren at some point and then became mothers? And that, of course, would be Sarah and Rivka and Leah and Rachel, this week's parsha. Ishto shel Manoach, this is the mother of Shimshon, who also was barren, and the angel came to her and said she would have her child Shimshon. Chana, the mother of Shmuel. Sion, which is very interesting, and please God, we should see Sion remain the happy mother of children. And then finally, the final one is Chana and her 7 sons. So this is very interesting, especially for those of you who are already familiar with the story, which we will read, that she actually lost all her sons, and yet we associate with her Em Habanim Smecha, the happy mother of children. So here are some other sources where we see her story. One is from Echa Rabbah, where we see her name is Miriam Bat Nachtom. And the most famous place we see it is in the Gemara, in Masachet Gittin. This is one of the passages that you can read on Tisha B'Av because it's such a sad story. And it begins with the king who says that, calls up each of her 7 sons individually, and each of her 7 sons bravely quote a pasuk from the Torah that is against idolatry, and each one is killed. Finally, the youngest son, it says that the emperor pitied him. Seeking a way to spare the boy's life, the emperor said to him, I will throw down my seal before you, bend over and pick it up, so that people will say that he has accepted the king's authority. The boy said to him, Woe, chaval to you, Caesar, woe to you, Caesar. If you think that for the sake of your honor, I should fulfill your command and do this, then for the sake of the honor of the Holy One, blessed be he, all the more so should I fulfill his command. As they were taking him out to be killed, his mother said to him, Give him to me so that I may give him a small kiss. She said to him, My son, go and say to your father Abraham, you bound 1 son to the altar, but I bound 7 altars. She too, in the end, went up to the roof, fell, and died. A divine voice emerged and said, A joyful mother of children, as she raised her children to be devoted in their service of God. In a certain sense, it's Yiddish Nachas, the saddest kind of Yiddish Nachas ever, to see your children being willing to die al Kiddush Hashem. We can only hope that as the hostages are still sitting kidnapped, that they are maintaining this type of faith that Hannah and her sons were able to maintain during the Greek persecution of our people. And you may have noticed that the title of these slides, I said, was thought. There are 3 garments, as the Alter Rebbe in the Tanya describes them, of all the mitzvot: thought, speech, and action. And you can categorize everything into one of those categories. I think the first commentator that mentions these categories is the Ibn Ezra on the 10 Commandments. You can do that exercise on your own. You can see in the 10 Commandments, it's actually a chiastic structure of thought, speech, action, action, speech, thought between Hashem and people and people and people. So Chana represents this garment lavush, of thought, that she was able to maintain her emunah with her children during these terrible times of persecution of the Jewish people. Next, we have speech, and this is going to be the daughter of the Kohen Gadol. This is, if you remember, in the halachic development piece of the shir, this is the daughter of the Kohen Gadol. It's unclear if it's Yochanan or if it's Matisyahu, the father. So it's unclear if she is the aunt of the Maccabees, Yehuda Maccabee and his brothers, or if she is the sister of the Maccabees. And this is a fascinating story. So here, in this collection, this is from Otsar HaMidrashim, which is an early 20th century work pulling together several midrashim that hadn't been collected in any one place before. It doesn't mean that they're modern 20th century midrashim. It just means that they weren't actually written down until then. These are stories that the Jewish people have kept with them for millennia. So here you can see she's described as the daughter of Yochanan Kohen Gadol. And we're going to read her story. So our rabbis taught, in the days of the evil Greek reign, they decreed on Israel many things, including that anyone who is marrying a woman, that woman will be taken by the general first, the Greek general, and afterwards will be returned to her husband. This is called first rights. We've seen this in, unfortunately, many different cultures. It's a way of weaponizing women and their bodies, which unfortunately we've seen all too recently. And indeed, this occurred for 3 years and 8 months. So that means for 3 years and 8 months, Bnei Israel did not conduct any weddings, because it would mean that the women would first have to go to the Greek general before they could have to be able to be with their husbands, until the daughter of Yochanan, the Kohen Gadol, was to be married. It's unclear why they decided to marry her off during this time. We don't know. When they wanted to bring her to the same general, she uncovered her head, tore her clothes, and stood naked before the nation. Immediately, Yehuda and his brothers were filled with rage toward her, and they said to bring her out and burn her. We're going to see a lot of references to other stories in Tanakh and Midrashim that we're familiar with. So here, of course, we're having a reference to Tamar, from Tamar and Yehuda, and here the brother's name is Yehuda. So she's following in the footsteps of Tamar, of making a bold step and risking getting burnt at the stake for what is perceived as a sin, but really it's a huge mitzvah. But do not let the matter be known to the government because of the danger of death. And she dared to be naked before all of this nation. Then she said to him, how could it be that I would be despised by my brothers and loved ones, and I should not be despised in the eyes of one uncircumcised and impure, that you want to betray me and bring me to lie with him? She's a very strong, brave girl. She says, I'm naked here before all of you holy people, and you want me to be naked before this evil, uncircumcised man. When Yehuda and his group heard this, they planned together to kill the general. She needed to take this very bold step in order to motivate the men, either her brothers or her nephews, to go to do something, to act. Immediately, they dressed the young girl in royal clothing and made a chuppah of myrtle, hadas, a reference to Esther. You can see all of the important women are mentioned here, from the house of the Chashmonai until the house of the general. When the general heard this, he said to his ministers and his servants, look at them. They are from the greatest of Israel, from the seed of Aaron the Kohen. How happy they are to do my will. They are worthy of great honor. And he commanded to bring outside his ministers and his servants. Just then, Yehuda and his group entered with his sister to the general, and they cut his head off and plundered everything. So if you remember from the development of the Halacha, that the association of cutting the head off to the daughter of the Kohen Gadol, but you'll see that missing from this story is any mention of cheese. We're going to see that in the Judas story later. And they killed his ministers and his servants, and they attacked the Greeks until they exterminated all but the most important of the government. And the Jews in the city were terrified for these young men of Israel. A bat kol came out and said, the young men were victorious, that they went out to make a battle on Antiochus. And these young men returned and closed the gates and did tshuva and busied themselves with Torah and Gemilut Chasadim. When the king of Greece heard that Israel had killed his general, he gathered all of his nation and came before Yerushalayim and brought her to distress. And the Jews were very afraid. So this story then leads directly into the Judith story. But before we go into that, I just wanted to show you, this is from an earlier page in the same collection of Otzar Midrashim. And here, instead of the daughter of Yochanan Kohen Gadol, it says the daughter of Matityahu Kohen Gadol. And there's one other reference here to women and to brothers, Mishimon v'Levi Achei Dina. In this story, the young woman is imploring them to act like their ancestors Shimon and Levi when Dinah was raped, and they went out and they killed the entire town of Shechem on the third day of their circumcision. So that is all. You see all of our Jewish heroines and Jewish heroes wrapped up into this one story and all the different references. And you see how her speech motivated the Jewish people, the men, to go to battle and to win the battle, that little mini battle. But then they were scared because it angered the Greek army that then besieged the city of Yerushalayim. And we have the story of Yehudit. There's so much artwork out there on Judith and Holofernes. Okay, there was a widow named Yehudit. She took her maid and walked to the gates of Yerushalayim, and she said, "Let me go out. Perhaps Hashem," which is called Hamakom, which again is another reference to Megillat Esther, where there's no mention of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there's no mention of God, and yet we have an allusion where Mordechai says to Esther, perhaps salvation come from another place, Makom Acher. So it could be that we're using that reference here to remind us of Esther. Will do a miracle by me. They opened the gates for her, and she went out and walked before the king. He asked her, "What do you request?" And she said, "My lord, I am a daughter of great men from Israel. My brothers are prophets. I have heard that they prophesied that tomorrow Yerushalayim will fall into your hands." When he heard this, he was very happy. He had one of his wise men who saw and predicted in the stars, and he said, "I see that Israel is doing tshuva, and you will not be able to overtake them. Return to your place." The king was filled with rage on him and commanded to seize him. They bound his hands and feet and hanged him on the tree next to Yerushalayim. The king proclaimed, "Tomorrow, when Yerushalayim is in our hands, we will kill him." The king believed Yehudit, and he fell in love with her. He asked her to marry him. She replied, "My lord, the king, I am not suitable even for one of your servants. But since your heart leans this way, proclaim in all the camp that anyone who sees two women walking by the spring should not harm them, since I need to go there to wash myself and immerse." Immediately, the proclamation was sent, and she did this, and the king made a great party, and they drank and got drunk. Afterwards, each one went to his tent, and the king sat in her lap and slept. In another version of this story, the one that is being cited by the early halachicists that we saw, she leaves Yerushalayim with her basket of famous cheese. She was known to be a famous cheesemaker. So she had her salty, salty cheese with her wine that she left with her basket. And she went into the king's tent and she fed him all her cheese. And then he had to drink all her wine. And then he fell asleep, completely dead drunk. And that's the point in that version of the story where she took his sword, cut off his head, and spread a sheet over him. Now, in the other version of the story, she puts the head in her now empty basket and goes back up to the gate of Jerusalem. She walked with the head of the king toward the gates of Jerusalem. She said, "Open the gates for me, for the Holy One, blessed be he, has done a miracle through me." They said to her, because they were watching from their lookout points of the walls of the city, and they saw her go into the tent of Holofernes. So they say, "Is it not enough that you hoard and corrupted, but you should also come here with false claims?" Immediately, she showed them the head of the king. When they saw it, they opened the gates, and a bat kol declared, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." When the Greeks heard this, they said, "Tomorrow we will come upon them." They went to the king and found him without a head. Another version of the story says that they took a pole from inside the walled city and they put the king's head on it and showed the whole army his severed head from outside of the walls. This is, by the way, a great bedtime story for your kids. My boys always loved it. Fear and terror fell upon them, and they all fled. Israel pursued after them and killed several of them. Thus Hashem quickly seeks revenge on our enemies and hurries our salvation. As it is written, and a redeemer shall come to Zion. So while this is apocryphic, both literally and figuratively, we learn from the Ben Ish Chai that it still has relevance for the Chanuka story involving the Greeks and a great miracle. So you can see that in the development of the Halacha, they're mixing up between the daughter of Yochanan ben Zakkai, or Matisyahu, and Yehudit, and the different stories. And it would be very interesting to do a whole study on how these stories developed and where they were and why they didn't seem to have original sources to quote from. In these, the rabbis who are very usually careful in citing their sources and their halachic works. But everyone seems to agree that somehow it was because of these women that this great miracle happened to the Jewish people. And Yehudit, of course, represents action. So here's our three categories. We have machshava, thought, dibur, speech, and maaseh, action. So I want us to spend some time what we can learn from these women and how we can dedicate our thought, our speech, and our action during this time where it's so necessary that we remain focused and that we remain motivated and that we're not paralyzed by what's happening. So I'd like you to ask yourself honestly, what are your thoughts during this time? What are you thinking about? And are these thoughts paralyzing you? Are they making you depressed? Not that any of us are not unhappy during this time, but there's a difference between being depressed so that you can't get anything done and being sad and motivated to act, to do something. So what are your thoughts? Are your thoughts promoting achdut? Are they promoting unity? Are your thoughts getting you closer to the Jewish people, closer to Hashem? And if these are not the type of thoughts that you're having at this time, what can you do about it? Can you maybe put different things on your bedside table? Maybe your phone is not the best thing to have on your bedside table right now, looking at the news in the middle of the night. Maybe a book of Emunah is something to put on your bedside table so that you can work on that if you can't sleep. And then maybe it'll put you to sleep. And you can get sleep, and then you can be healthier to start the next day in this cycle of this war. So in honor of Chana and her 7 sons, who remained steadfast in their emunah throughout their horrible, horrible ordeal, how can we remain steadfast in our own emunah? And what can we do right now to work on that and to improve our thoughts? And the same thing with our speech. What are we talking about? Are we talking about things that can work towards unity? You can note the difference. A lot of people have noted the differences between our rally in America on Tuesday in Washington, D.C., which I was very privileged to be a part of, and the rallies of the other side. There was a meme going around about how someone asked a police officer how his day was, and he says he received a whole career's worth of thank yous in one day. That's the Jewish people. And that's how we use our speech. We use our speech to promote unity. We use our speech to promote belief in ethical monotheism and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's what you saw at the rally as well. The rally was about being pro-Israel, pro the Jewish people. It spent very little time being anti. And we too can work on our speech to be pro what we believe in, pro what's important, and pro-unity, both with the Jewish people and with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And then finally, our actions. What are we doing? What are we able to do? Some of us, my nephew, Noah Moshe Dov ben Rachaitza, who's in Gaza right now, is very actively doing for the Jewish people. My son, Matan Moshe ben Zisa Nechama, is guarding through his Miluim, a yeshuv in the Gush, and whoever else has sons, husbands, fathers, brothers, in the army right now, doing their part for the Jewish people, very actively defending and protecting the Jewish people. You should have them in mind, and they should be kept safe by HaKadosh Baruch Hu during this time. They are actively doing. But for those of us who are not, what can we do? Sometimes, if you are the mother or brother or sister or son or daughter of said soldier, you can just do something for them, take care of them. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes it's enough just to take care of yourself. We shouldn't let our own health suffer. We should try to stay as healthy as we can so that we can do the best avoda for HaKadosh Baruch Hu during this time. Hashem wants us healthy and wants us strong, whether we're on the physical battlefield or the spiritual battlefield. We all have a role to play in our actions. And sometimes, for some, you can actually do something. If you're in Israel, you can go harvest all the neglected fruits and vegetables on the farms that all of the soldiers pulled up on Miluim and all the foreign workers haven't been able to get to. That's an amazing thing that people are doing. In America, people are putting up posters of the hostages, that we don't forget them, that we always keep them in our minds. There are a lot of things that we can do. And if you can only take care of yourself, I don't think anybody should feel guilty. We all have to do what we can in this war, whether it's taking care of yourself or actively doing something for the Jewish people. So I'd like to leave you, after we've learned these 3 stories of the women and the special role that women played in the Chanuka story, and of course also in the Purim story and in the Pesach story, that may it be God's will that we will see people come up to motivate us in this time with their thought, their speech, and their action. And just like it was the righteous women of the generation during the time of Egypt that we were redeemed, so too should the righteous men and women of this generation allow us to be redeemed speedily in our day. Thank you very much. Okay, I still have over 30 minutes. So I think I will give a bonus share. I did not expect that to go so quickly. Okay, I think I actually want to add on to what Rabbi Alman was speaking about with the Ishmaelim and the Amalekim. So I'm going to exit this. And I want to show you another example where we can see thought, speech, and action. Okay, I'm going to show you Psukim from Chabad.org. Okay, so this is right after Avraham gets the covenant between the parts, the Brit Bein HaBetzarim from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and he's promised the promise that all the Avot receive. In this week's Parsha, we see Yaakov receiving this promise of Eretz and Zerah, land and seed. So he's just promised that in chapter 15, Perek Tetvav of Bereshit. In Perek Tetzayin, Sarah has this realization that she has not been able to give Avram children, and she offers her handmaid Hagar, the Egyptian princess, to Avraham. So Avram then takes Hagar, and right away Hagar becomes pregnant. And in that time that she saw that she was pregnant, we see in Pasuk Vav, Vataikal Gvirta Be'eneha, that her mistress became light or unimportant in her eyes. And Rashi there says that what she's doing is she's saying to everybody that Sarah's really a hypocrite. She thinks she's so righteous, but she was with this man for decades and she never got pregnant. I was with him for one night and I became pregnant. So she's treating her with an incredible amount of disrespect. So Sarai then says to Avraham, Chamasi alecha. So a lot of people spoke about the word Hamas in the Noach story. Hamas also appears here in Lech Lecha. Chamasi alecha. They translated here as, may my injustice be upon you. I gave you my handmaid into your bosom, and she saw that she had become pregnant, and I became unimportant in her eyes. May the Lord judge between me and you. Okay, I want to show you Rashi here, but before I show you Rashi, I just want to tell you something very scary that the Ramban says. So here, Avram said to Sarah, here is your handmaid in your hand, do to her that which is proper in your eyes. And what does Sarah do? Vata'aneha Sarai. This word, it says here, afflicted. Afflicted also means tortured. And ironically, it was just used in the Brit Bein the Betarim, the previous parak, when Hashem tells Avraham that his people will be a stranger. How do you say a stranger? Ger. What's Hagar? You can also read Hagar as Hagar, the stranger, where they will be enslaved. They'll be strangers in a strange land. They'll be enslaved and they'll be tortured. The same language repeats itself in this very next parak between Sarai and Hagar, and she tortured her. And the Ramban says something very scary. I'm not going to end with this, which is why I skipped ahead, and then we'll go to the previous Rashi next. The Ramban says it's because of Sarai's treatment of Hagar that Hagar's children continue to afflict us to this very day. Okay, so back to the Hamas. This is the definition of Hamas in Parshat Vayera. So what does Sarah say? May my injustice, Hamasi, be upon you. For the injustice that has been done to me, I lay the punishment upon you. When you pray to Hashem, and I want to read the Hebrew here, he's quoting only a little bit. This is in the very beginning of Perek Tetvav, right before Hashem makes the Brit with him, the Brit Bein B'Tarim. Avram says, I don't have any children, and he davens for children. But what does he say? Listen carefully. Ma titein li va'anochi holech ariri. You can hear it even in the Hebrew. Me, me, me. And I could never have said this if Rashi himself did not say it. What will you give me, since I am going childless? You prayed only for yourself, whereas you should have prayed for both of us, and I would have been remembered with you. So this is the first definition of Hamas, of the injustice, that he didn't daven properly. He didn't daven for everybody. There are certain mefarshim that have defenses of Avram and why he davened this way, and they're all really beautiful and meaningful. So I don't want you to be left with this bad impression of Avram having selfish davening, but this is the perception of Sarai at this time. You only prayed for yourself. Second definition, moreover, you are stealing from me. So you might have remembered from Parshat Noach that Hamas there meant gazel, stealing. So here Rashi's taking the definition of stealing. You are stealing from me your protective words, for you hear my degradation and you remain silent. You are depriving me of the words you should have spoken to Hagar to reprimand her on my behalf. So what are the two lessons of Hamas, of the relationship of Avram and Sarah in this Rashi? There are two things that you are already doing. I don't need to tell you to do them. You're davening properly for all the Jewish people, and you're not being silent. We're all speaking up. You're all here today. You're learning Torah. You're getting strengthened. You're getting chizuk. That's what this 24 hours is all about. Ma'afela le'ora, getting chizuk and strengthened during this horrible time. So that's what we learn about Hamas. Now I want to take you a little further in Bereshit. As we see, these parshiot have just been unbelievable during this time, and there's a whole new relevance to the Torah in our lives today. So Hagar runs away, and she has this vision from Hashem. And what does she name the place where she has this vision? She names the place Be'er L'chai Ro'i, the well of the living seeing. Okay, I'm going to repeat that. Be'er L'chai Ro'i. When's the next time we see Be'er L'chai Ro'i? we see it from Chayei Sarah. So the end of Chayei Sarah, after when Eliezer is on his way bringing Rivka back to marry Avraham. So it's the first time we see Yitzchak. And it's actually really interesting because we didn't see Yitzchak after the Akedah. It only tells us Avraham came down from the mountain. And we didn't see Yitzchak at his mother's funeral. And we don't see Yitzchak in the whole process of finding him his wife. So the next time we see Yitzchak is when Eliezer is on his way with Rivka to bring him as a wife to Yitzchak. And where is he coming from? He's coming from Be'er L'chai Ro'i, the place that Hagar named. It's her place. And that's where Yitzchak was. And the rabbis tell us, the Midrash tells us, what was Yitzchak doing there? Just like Yitzchak's father, Avraham, was busy finding a wife for his son. So Yitzchak said, how can I get married and my father be alone? And he went back and he brought Hagar to his father, Avraham. And Hagar, of course, her name changes to Keturah. And they get married and they have 6 other children, whatever that means. And then, that's in Perek Chafav, we see Avram took another wife. Her name was Keturah. Rashi tells us Keturah is based on the Ketoret, the sweet-smelling spices, because she had improved her ways. And what's really interesting about this is that this is the entire... So Sarah died at 127. That means Avram was 137. We're told how Avram devotes the next part of his life to finding a wife, to buying land, the Marat Machpelah, to be able to bury Sarah and own land in the land of Israel, and to finding a wife for his son. And then he gets married, he has all these children, and in Pasuk Zayin, he dies. So without Sarah, we really don't learn any meaningful parts of his life. But he was 175 when he died. And what happens? Yitzchak and Yishmael, his sons, buried him in the cave of Machpelah. So not only was Yitzchak able to bring back Hagar to his father, but he was also able to bring back Yishmael. And the rabbis tell us that this represents Yishmael's tshuva, that Yitzchak and Yishmael, the sons of Abraham, and this is why all of the treaties with the Arab nations are called the Abraham Accords, because it's the sons of Abraham. This is why we have hope. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs speaks about this in one of his essays on Parshat Chayei Sarah, that this is hope for the Jews and the Arab people. I think we can safely say that Hamas is not a part of this, but for the rest of the Arab people, we can maintain that hope even in these dark days, that we will see peace with the sons of Abraham. And now I want to suggest to you something with Esav as well, just like Rabbi Alman was talking about Yishmael and Esav as well. So you probably know the famous Midrash. I'm going to show Rashi here so you can see it. By the way, just a little interesting fact that it says, Ve'ele toldot Yishmael, here in Pasuk Yud Bet, Ve'ele toldot Yishmael, which sounds a lot like Ve'ele toldot Yitzchak in Parshat Yud Tet, which is where our Parsha Toldot begins. So for the Christian inventors of the chapters are not Jewish. For them, Eila Toldot Yishmael and Eila Toldot Yitzchak, these are the generations of Yishmael and these are the generations of Isaac, are part of the same chapter. For us, the Jewish people, Eila Toldot Yitzchak is a brand new Parsha. And that, of course, was last week's Parsha. So you know the famous Midrash that Rivka is pregnant and the babies are fighting between them in the womb. And you see here, Rashi says, when she passed the entrances of the Torah academies of Shem and Aver, Yaakov would run and struggle to come out. When she passed the entrance of a temple of idolatry, Esav would run and struggle to come out. There's a rabbi, the Siftei Kohen, who is a student of Rav Yosef Cairo in Tzfat, and he asks a very simple question, but something I had never thought about before. What was Rivka doing walking by houses of idolatry? It's a really good question. So he answers that perhaps she learned from her husband, Yitzchak, who learned from his parents that we try to encourage people to bring them to a life of ethical monotheism. And maybe Rivka, in her desire to influence people to be better, just like she herself came from a family and a town of idolatry and adapted and embraced ethical monotheism to become one of our imahot, so too did she want to spread that word, just like her in-laws had spread the word in their time. And that's what she was doing, passing by the house of idolatry. And perhaps, too, I'd like to suggest that Esav had free will. And while Esav had this character trait, even in the womb, to run to a house of idolatry, perhaps he too, had he used his free will to decide to do the right thing, perhaps he too could have had a tremendous influence on idolaters and brought them into ethical monotheism at the time. And instead, he chose idolatry. But there's hope even for him. So we see this in this Rashi. When Hashem says to her, he explains to her, 2 nations are in your womb. So you see in the Hebrew, it says Shnei Goyim, that's how we read it, but it's written Geim, which sounds like prides. And Rashi says something super weird. He says it's written Geim, which pronounced like Geim with an aleph, exalted persons. These were Antoninus and Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, from whose table neither radishes nor lettuce were lacking in the summer or the winter. Now, who is Antoninus? He was one of the Roman emperors. So Rome obviously represents Edom, which represents Esav. And he had this very special relationship with Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. And if you look through the Gemara, the origin story is such that when Rabbi and Antoninus were born, their mothers were friends. And the Roman emperor of that time made a decree against circumcision. And for some reason, he heard that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi had been circumcised, and he called them up to appear before him. Antoninus's mother offered to trade babies, so that Antoninus's mother would nurse Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, and Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's mother would take Antoninus with her and nurse him on the way to go be in front of the emperor and show her uncircumcised son. And in this way, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was saved. And the decree against circumcision was taken away because the Roman emperor realized he couldn't do anything for the Jewish people. He thought it must be a miracle. So Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi and Antoninus remained friends. And in fact, they seem to have learned Torah together. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi quotes Antoninus actually on the topic of free will and when it emerges, when the Yetzer Hara emerges, whether the Yetzer Hara is in the womb or not until out of the womb. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi argues that it's in the womb, that you already have your character traits in the womb. And Antoninus convinces him otherwise, that no, it appears afterwards. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi quotes Antoninus in this way. And here we can really see the Talmud Yerushalmi tells us that towards the end of his life, either Antoninus converted and he himself got circumcised, or he will be one of the righteous Gentiles leading the way at the time of Mashiach. And here, I think when we read between the lines, as much as we have a lot of commentary that is animosity about Ishmael, about Esav, when we read between the lines and we read the pshat of the psukim, we see that there really is hope for all the children of Abraham, and all the 3 monotheistic religions of the world, the children of Yitzchak, Yaakov, Yishmael, Esav, of all of us living together peacefully and supporting each other. And I'd really, really like to leave us with that notion that there is hope, that there will be brighter days, that this war will over, please, with all the hostages and all of the soldiers returned healthy in both body and mind, and that we will see true peace and the true era of Mashiach speedily in our days.